Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 228. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Linda Ambrus Broenniman about her new book, The Politzer Saga. This epic tale is part memoir, part biography, and part history, and it illuminates the Hungarian Jewish experience over the last 300 years. Linda wanted to learn about her family history, but never intended to write a book about it. That is, until she learned the truth. At the age of 27, Linda accidentally found out that her father was Jewish, after being told her whole life that he, like herself and the rest of her family, was Catholic. When she began researching her genealogy, she uncovered the world of the Politzers, a cast of characters so amazing and surprising, they seemed almost fictional. With a lot of work and a lot of help, Linda uncovered 8 generations of Politzers and learned a great deal about family, heritage, and history along the way. In this episode, I'll chat with Linda about her writing journey, the types of records she searched, and the places she traveled to conduct her research, and why she feels freer now that she knows her family's story, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Linda Ambrus Broenniman, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Stacey, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor being here on your show.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, The Politzer Saga. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, that's interesting that you asked that because I never intended to write a book. My intention was actually to learn about the history of my family. And just a little bit of background that will help your audience. When I was 27, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, a family of 7 children born to Catholic Hungarian parents who had emigrated from Hungary and came to the U.S. to start a new life. So we grew up Catholic, and when I was 27, I accidentally found out that my father was Jewish. But I didn't do anything about it until, oh goodness, 30 years later, 30 plus years later. My parents' house caught fire, and my sister miraculously saved a box. And the contents of the box sort of spurred this journey. I found, documents and letters and photographs that, some dated back to the late 1800s. And so I knew I had to learn about the history of my family with that. And what I found on this remarkable search was 8 generations of the Politzers. And that's a name that I didn't even know I was related to. So, as we started to do research, and I had worked with a Hungarian lawyer and sociologist who helped me do all this research, I needed to really brush up on my history. And as I learned about history to understand sort of the context of the times and the zeitgeist of the times and why they made the kinds of decisions they did, I needed a way to organize it. And I just started writing and creating and ended up with a book. But and then what also happened, why I really then thought it was a good idea to publish it, was these stories, these characters they're almost fictional characters. They're remarkable people. And the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives actually thought the same way. So as they were renovating the Rumbach Synagogue, which is an amazing synagogue in Budapest, they decided to create a permanent exhibit to help, to really the reason to inspire others to delve into their own history. And they chose all the stories about stories and photos of my family as the basis of the exhibit. So when they decided to do that with the exhibit, I decided, okay, I really need to publish the book because the stories are so much richer than what the exhibit can show. So that's how the book came about.
So, what started off, it sounds like, as sort of an innocent search to find out a little bit more about your family turned into a permanent exhibit and a published book. Now, that's probably not most people's journey when they go on ancestry.com or whatever to find out a little bit more about their relatives. So, let's dive into what it was that you found that warranted a permanent exhibit and book length treatment. So let's start with your parents, if you don't
Uh,
mind.
yeah.
So, and on this journey, if you don't mind, maybe tell us what you found, how you found it,
hmm
and what jumped out at you, what surprised you, because I'm sure there were more than enough surprises
Oh my
on this
goodness.
journey.
There were so many surprises, I can't tell you. So before I start talking about my parents are really a critical part of this, but let me go back a little bit.
Sure.
First of all, we were able to find 8 generations back, which in and of itself is a pretty remarkable thing. When I started on this search, and I will give you the name of the gentleman, the Hungarian gentleman, his name was András Kazitsky, and he was truly a brilliant man and an amazing sleuth and became just such a trusted partner and friend. And unfortunately, he died. He was struggling with colon cancer, and he died in 21. And I actually dedicated the book to him because he was such a critical part of it. But I'll never forget when Andres and I first started working together, he just did a simple Google search, and his Google search revealed over 300 articles just either written by or written about my great great grandfather Ignaz Misner, who it turned out became he grew up in complete poverty. He was orphaned in the cholera epidemic of 1855, but he became a prominent lawyer, one of the founding members of the Budapest Bar, and just a incredible Hungarian patriot, a Jewish activist, a philanthropist. So he just had a lot of articles, and it's that kind of thing that we found. We also found I had a very famous great great uncle, Adam Politzer, who today, if you ask ear, nose, and throat surgeons, they recognize the name. He is considered the father of otology, which is the study of the ear. And he lived back, he died in 1922, so he lived quite a bit earlier, but he's still well known today, and there's an Adam Politzer Society. What we found is even though we weren't, famous bankers or like the Warburgs and the Rothschilds and people like that, they were upper middle class family who really contributed to the medical and I will say artistic world of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and later, Hungary.
Well, let's talk about some of these because, like you said, you go back 8 generations,
Yeah.
which is an unusual feat for anyone, I think, searching for their roots. Let's talk about some of the people on that family tree that surprised you. You mentioned two that were very influential,
Uh,
particularly in their fields and in the broader sense, certainly very influential for their time. Was there anyone else on that tree that jumped out at you like, just a surprise that you didn't expect, either what they did or who they knew, what circles they ran in, etc.?
It's almost the book has it is the chapters go by sort of person, and the exhibit follows the same kind of thing. And I would say almost every generation was this huge surprise. And this, I mean, as I said before, they were almost like these fictional characters that were just amazing. So starting off with going back all the way 8 generations to Isaac. And Isaac was a violin virtuoso. And he got in trouble with his landlord because his landlord asked him to play on Shabbat, and he refused, and this huge argument ensued. And he used Christ's name in vain. And as a result of that, just using Christ's name in vain, the church authorities from Prague were coming to dispense justice. And the justice was he was supposed to be burned at the stake. So it's things like that that, he escaped, obviously, because I wouldn't be here otherwise. But he escaped, and eventually he came back to the area of what is now the town is called Kidzay, which is in Austria, but it's really a suburb of Bratislava. And there, it's interesting. I found out how the name Politzer came to be. So in 1787, I think it was, the Austro-Hungarian emperor had a decree that all Jews needed to take on surnames. Before that, they were known as, Isaac was known as Isaac, son of Moses. But they were supposed to take on surnames for the sole purpose of tax control, and Jews were taxed much more heavily than Christians. And so he was given the name Politz after his hometown, given the name Politzer after his hometown of Politz. And it's actually the same town where Joseph Politzer's family came from. And one of the surprises was, going back to Adam Politzer, we found some letters between Adam Politzer and Joseph Politzer and Joseph Politzer's brother, and they called each other cousin. But we could never actually prove, were they actually blood relatives or were they just good friends who called themselves cousin. So yeah, they knew all of these people. So it was remarkable.
Tell us a little bit about how the exhibit came into being, because you said that they feature a number of your family's stories. So
Yeah, the whole exhibit is based on my family's stories. It's actually called the Politzer Saga exhibit. What happened was, when Andras was doing his research, he would spend a lot of time at the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives. I was there, and they have these huge handwritten books, registers that it's back from the 1700s and 1800s, and it's remarkable. So he was spending a lot of time going through those registers and interacted with some of the historians there, and so they got excited about the stories and what he was finding. And it just happened to coincide with this renovation of the Rombach synagogue, and they wanted to do a permanent exhibit, so they decided to feature my family.
hmm. Well, I'm curious where you found your information. You mentioned these registers, but where were some of the places you had to go or had to dig to find
Well,
this
yeah,
information?
that's such a good question. And I will say we got very lucky. So I mean, Andras would find things. He'd start out in cemeteries, quite frankly, and it's interesting that cemeteries sort of became the place where I felt most connected to my family, with their names on these incredible stone crypts. But he would go to marriage registers, birth certificates, death certificates. But he even found information. He found, as I said, on articles that have been put online, are other articles, books written about my family, books written by family members. Found phone books, school records. He found a lot of school records about my grandfather from his school in Debrecen, which was really interesting, and just every kinds of piece of information that he found. It sort of one, he was very meticulous and he was very careful to make sure that if he found something, it was about the right person because back in those, back, especially when it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were so many different languages spoken. So Latin was the official language, but there's German, Hungarian, and then all of the other different countries that had made up the empire. And so the spelling could be different. So Pulitzer could be spelled, four or five different ways, and the first name could be spelled four or five different ways. So he always had to verify that whatever information he was finding was about my family's relatives, not somebody else's. So
Right.
it was challenging. I will say it was a very challenging task, but he was brilliant.
And how long did this take you from starting, getting that box, opening it, and deciding, okay, maybe let's look here, to finally publishing the book?
About 8 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. But it was I think it was a journey of love, I will say.
Yeah.
It's-
And your book contains a family tree, which is quite impressive. And there's a lot of branches on it. How did you keep track of it all? Did you have post-it notes with yarn attached? Did it look like one of those
something
murder
that's
mystery kind of
it's
crime
so
scene
funny.
rooms?
So funny that you say that. That's so great because that's how I started. It was so funny. I work out in our home. I have an office that's my office, and I started and I took these boxes, right? These moving boxes and pulled them apart and said, okay, they're going to be my bulletin boards. And I started putting up these cards, right? And after a while, I couldn't even move in my office, and I still wasn't getting it right. So I decided this isn't going to work. I went on. I actually started using a software program called Legacy, and that's sort of what really helped me keep
Mm.
things straight.
Yes, probably better than just tacking up cards and
Yes.
yes. Well,
Yeah.
after being on this journey, I'm curious, what has changed for you after learning all of this about your family? Has has anything changed for you personally now?
That is such a great question. I can't tell you what a great question that is. Because yes, a lot has changed, but it's more about how I think I feel inside. The changes are internal, and so they're sometimes hard to put into words. But if I think what happens is when you grow up, there's secrets. And my parents, I had a wonderful childhood. My parents tried to give us everything they could possibly give us, but I still knew there were secrets. And and it's hard to when you know there's secrets, I think you think there's something wrong with you. And so there's a lot of self-doubt, I would say, and a lot of maybe I wasn't quite so open with other people because I thought there was something wrong with me. So I think this has lifted all of that. And I just feel freer and able to talk about things more and connect with people more, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so and it certainly has also given me a much greater appreciation for Judaism and for things for what's going on today, all the anti-Semitic rhetoric and horrible actions that are going on. It's made me much more sensitive to the way people treat each other, I think.
I imagine you had a lot of questions answered for you in this process. I mean, it was
Yes.
8 years and you have a book about it. Are you still left with questions, or were all the questions answered?
No, I think there's always questions. There's so much that, I wish I could have asked my parents, but my parents really put up this web of secrecy. And I especially think about my grandmother because my grandmother lived with us. And I'll give you an example. We had a painting of my grandfather that hung in our dining room. And we knew it was our grandfather, but we never really knew anything about him. And if we asked my father would say, oh, he was a World War I hero, which he was. But we never really knew anything more. And he also was a very prominent lawyer and a bank executive. But we never really knew anything more. And I remember asking my grandmother, how did he die? And she said, oh, he was a political prisoner and died in concentration camp. And I just sort of accepted it. And I could tell I couldn't ask more because she would get so sad that I didn't want to bring her more grief. So I would just drop it. But, in the book, I really describe, how he was taken and the tragedy of this. He was a remarkable man and he did, we don't know actually if he died in a concentration camp or if he was on a forced labor march. When the Americans were coming, they knew that they had lost. The Nazis knew they had lost, but they didn't want to turn any of the survivors over to the US or the Allied forces. So they would take them on these forced labor marches where almost everyone died. So it was just sort of heart-wrenching. And I think the other thing that this has allowed me to do is to really honor their memory. And that's one of the things that, by not knowing, it almost feels like they had died twice. And so it's been a gift to be able to connect with them in this way and to honor their memory.
Well, let's go back to your parents, because there were things you found out even about your parents in all of this.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I say, we think we know our parents, but loving them doesn't really mean we know them. And I was really shocked at how little I knew about their lives, their early lives. So they met in medical school. They were both medical students. My father was instantly smitten with my mother and pursued her. And they got engaged 18 months later in May 1944, 2 days before my father was taken to a Nazi labor camp. And that was, I think, one of the biggest shocks that I never knew that he served in a labor camp. And these were, horrific camps. He had grown up sort of in a life of privilege. They were, well-to-do, and he had had a privileged life, and then being taken to a labor camp, I think, had been a huge shock. And one of the things I found in the box were letters between my mother and my father, and I will say they were heartbreaking. But meanwhile, also, my mother had one of her best friends, Ava Klein, was Jewish, and Ava asked my mother to move into a shuttered factory that had been owned by one of her boyfriend's friends, and it was shuttered because of the anti-Jewish laws that were passed then. And she moved into this factory complex to save her friend and her family and her boyfriend, who was a rabbi at the time, and his family, and the factory owner's family, and several others. And when my father escaped from labor camp and was able to make it back to Budapest, she hid him. She already was had my grandmother. She hid my grandmother, and she hid several other people, and we actually don't know how many she saved, but she was actually named as a righteous Gentile, righteous among the nations in 2006.
Yeah, that's a lot to learn about your parents.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, and it's remarkable to think, they were 20 years old.
Right. Right. Was there anyone that you found on this journey that you felt was sort of a kindred spirit? Anybody
Uh,
in your background that you really identified with or thought you would probably have connected with had they been alive?
I want to tell you all of them, but but probably there's two that really stand out for me. And one of them was my great grandmother, Margit Politzer. She was she was just remarkable. And I remember my father and my mother would talk about her on occasion. She was one of these people that my father would describe her as the go-to person. Anyone who had a problem, they could go to Margit and ask her to solve it. And my mother actually told me also on one trip that when the Jewish laws started to come in place, it was horrific. I mean, almost I don't remember the numbers, but hundreds of thousands of people were basically put out of work with no way to earn a living. And so that meant that their families were starving. And Margit opened her house, and she would have allow anyone to come and ask for help. And she would try to help them find work with her. She had a vast network of friends, both Jewish and Christian, and she would try to help them find work. If they were sick, she would send them to the doctors and she would pay for their care. And she often paid for many of her friends and servants' tuition for their children, and she would give them food. So she was so generous of spirit and such a philanthropist. And she survived horrific events herself and just was always one of these positive forces. So yeah, she was someone, but her father was the Ignaz Misner, the lawyer that I had previously described, and he was remarkable too. So he, at the age of, they had all of their properties were taken. They had a huge farm outside of Budapest, which was taken because Jews were no longer allowed to own properties. She had a beautiful villa up in the hills in Buda with gorgeous gardens, and that was taken. And then they had a big house in Pest, and that was taken. And then after the war, and she had lost so many family members, but after the war, when the communists came in, it was just as bad. She actually had to she repaired her house in Pest. She had to sell off many properties because of the hyperinflation. And then she was expelled and she was given a day. And she and my grandmother were expelled and had to live on a farm and work on a farm for 2 years because they were, quote, bourgeois capitalists. So she survived all of that, and yet she came back after Stalin's death. They were allowed to return. She was allowed to rent 3 rooms in her big house, and that was it. And she lived out her years there. And so it's really quite tragic when you think about what she had and what she lost, but she never lost her spirit. and she's just an indomitable spirit.
Sounds like it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now that you've got this book completed, I'm curious, do you think there are any more books in your future, either again about family members or anything else? You mentioned that you weren't planning to write a book about this, but how about writing any other books?
Well, what's interesting is when I when I wrote the manuscript, it was actually much bigger than this book. And I worked with an editor, and the editor said, "Well, you need to split it into two books." So I will get back to that other book. I am definitely planning to do that, and I'm not quite sure when, but I will.
Okay. All right.
So,
Very
yeah.
good. Well, Linda, if people want to learn more about you and your books, your family, things going on, etc., where can they go to find you and that information?
Yeah, I have a website, and it's PolitzerSaga.com. So they can find a lot of information there. I'm also on Facebook, Linda Broenniman Author, and on Instagram, same thing, Linda Broenniman Author. So yeah, I would love to connect with your readers.
And if they want to purchase a copy of the Politzer Saga, where can they go to buy it?
It's on online, so Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And if they live in Buffalo, it's at Talking Leaves bookstore. And if they live in Cleveland, it's at Max Backs Books.
Wonderful. Well, Linda, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with the Politzer Saga. And the sequel, we'll look for that down the road. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished here.
Oh, Stacy, thank you so much. I really appreciate your having me on your program and enjoyed this conversation and look forward to more.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.